is Anita Arriola. I'm an attorney. My family is the Arriola family from Barragata, also known as Arut, and my mother's family is from Sinahanya, the Paris family, and their family name is Zinza.
Thank you. Would you mind telling us some of the highlights from the time a few years ago when you were dealing with and very much at the forefront of the whole controversy surrounding the bill that outlawed abortion on Guam?
The bill was known as Public Law 20-134, and it was a law that banned all abortions on Guam except in the case of where the mother's life was endangered. It had no exceptions for rape, incest, or severe fetal deformity or any other exceptions. And it also contained an anti-solicitation provision, which made it illegal for women to solicit abortions or advise, where to get abortions. And that made the law kind of unique because that anti-solicitation provision hadn't been seen in any other previous abortion laws. And so that law was passed, I believe, sometime in 1990 by Governor Joseph Atta. He signed it into law after the legislature passed it. And so I became involved because I was living in Guam at the time. I had just returned from practicing law in San Francisco for several years, and I, was opposed to the law. I was here when the bill was debated on the floor of the legislature, and then when it was signed into law by Governor Atta. And pretty much immediately after he signed the law, I contacted people that I knew back in San Francisco and in New York, particularly the ACLU, to advise them about this law and to tell them about, the repercussions of this type of a law in Guam, but also in the entire United States because we're in American territory. And as a result of those phone calls, I had, a person named Janet Benchoff, who was an attorney with the ACLU RFP, the Reproductive Freedom Project at the time, and she came out here to Guam and assisted me in lobbying against the bill. But, of course, we were unsuccessful because the bill was enacted into law.
And she actually, didn't she deliberately violate the no solicitation aspect of the bill?
Yes, she did. When she came out here, I had never met her before, but when she came out here, we sat down and basically talked about the strategy of opposing this bill. She and I tried to get a meeting with Governor Atta to influence him into not signing the bill into law. We also talked to other legislators. I had submitted written testimony opposing the bill, and Janet appeared before, I believe it was the Rotary Club at that time, to essentially violate the law and to test the provisions. She read from the Hawaii Yellow Pages to advise women on Guam where to get abortions in Hawaii, and that sparked, her prosecution under the law.
What made you choose that strategy? Do you remember?
Well, the law was so extreme with that anti-solicitation provision that we felt that was probably the biggest way to get everybody's attention. That this was such a bad law, that it violated not only women's, doctors, nurses, and other people's civil rights in terms of their right of privacy and their right to an abortion, but also and to perform abortions, but also their right of free speech. That not only could abortions not be had on Guam, but that you couldn't even discuss it. You couldn't advise women about where to go for abortions. A doctor and a nurse could not advise their patient even about what their options were. If they had an unwanted pregnancy or if there was a rape or incest or severe fetal deformities. And so, that was a strategy that I think was intended to highlight how bad the law was, but also how extreme it was. Well, I think that I have to start with my parents. As we all do. My parents raised and educated us to be all very independent thinkers. We all went to college. They really reared us to value education, to value and express our own opinions and our points of view. And I think anyone who knows our family can definitely say that each of us has very strong points of view, and many times we're often opposed to each other. But we respect each other's point of view, and we also support each other's right to express those points of view, even if we disagree with them. And that has actually happened over the last, many years. Some of us are in public service, some are not, some are in private, organizations or businesses, and we have expressed quite different views on many pieces of legislation, on many pieces of public policy, but we still respect each other's viewpoints, even if they're in disagreement. And so, I start out by saying that, that's the way that our parents raised us. I also went to a women's school. I attended Smith College. I also attended a girls' high school, an all-girls high school here in Guam, the Academy of Our Lady of Guam, and those certainly shaped my views in terms of watching very strong, independent girls and women make up their minds about, all kinds of issues, and particularly the right to autonomy and integrity of a woman's body. And then, I went to Georgetown Law School, where I was involved in a public interest law program, and I represented people with underserved interests. And then I practiced law in San Francisco at a public interest law firm called Public Advocates, which also served underserved interests. And primarily I did a lot of litigation involving civil rights and constitutional violations. A lot of housing, racial, education, and other discrimination cases. Those were primarily the cases that I handled. And so, it was sort of a natural segue to come back to Guam, and even though I was in a private firm, to oppose this law, which I thought, really violated the constitutional rights and privacy rights, not just of women, but really of everyone in Guam. Well, there was a lot of division. It was a very divisive issue. The law really created a great deal of opposition to the bill as well as support for the bill. And I just remember the Archbishop, Archbishop Aparon, standing, at the legislature and exhorting the senators to pass this bill. And I really felt that was a violation of the separation between church and state. But I think reminds me of that saying by Martin Luther King that when you're silent, something, I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of was when you're silent is when you really allow injustices to persist. And I couldn't be silent about it. Every way in which I had been raised, every influence in which that it had a big impact on my life in terms of my education and my public interest law career, led me to oppose this law, and I couldn't be silent about it. I think the thing that really assisted me greatly was having the support of the ACLU and other people and friends in the United States, mainland, but also having a really great core group of people here in Guam who really almost literally came out of the woodwork. I was amazed, and I think a lot of people were amazed at the number of people who came out in opposition to the bill, despite the support of the bill, by the Catholic Church. The Guam Nurses Association came together, the Guam Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, both of which were main plaintiffs in the case, formed immediately and said, we're going to oppose this law because it ultimately affected their medical practice. It affected their patients. It affected the nurses' ability to talk to the patients about what their options were. And then a lot of people came out just really believing that this was an extreme law. I think maybe if it hadn't been so extreme, there might have been, less opposition and less of a groundswelling of support in opposition to the law. But I think because of its extremeness, people really came out and just thought this is a bad law, and it should not have effect in Guam. Well, specifically speaking about the right to an abortion, I think that, I think it's fairly clear that the Right to Life's movement is now on eroding the right to an abortion bit by bit, stage by stage, step by step, and they're doing that by, passing these bills and these laws that, are just making it so much harder for abortion clinics and providers to survive, or for them to give and provide any abortion services at all. And we see that with, all of the recent state legislations, particularly I would say in the last 5 or 6 years, where states are passing laws that are preventing clinics from operating in a particular way. So I think the strategy now is not to pass outright abortion bans, because I think that they believe that's probably not going to go anywhere, that ban will probably not be upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so their strategy now is just to erode it little by little, state by state. And so far, some of those attacks are working, but many others are not.
Do you see any of that happening on Guam?
They have already happened in Guam. Yeah. I mean, we have already quite a few pieces of legislation that have passed without very much, debate or discussion. For example, one recent law that passed was that doctors now have to give the fetal age of fetuses, that are aborted. And various types of laws like that, where really they're just trying to penalize abortion providers. I don't really see the point to something like that, but they're trying to make it harder and harder and more regulated for abortion providers, I suppose, to be caught in some kind of, web of criminal wrongdoing, so that they can punish these abortion providers. They seem to be more punitive than anything else.
Certainly not medically necessary.
Absolutely not medically necessary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's very interesting too, because of course the issue was decided in the courts with regard to public law again, but the issue was decided ultimately according to U.S. federal law.
Yes.
And so that was what decided the issue, and so on. But do you ever, because there is sort of a decolonization movement, there's talk about the different political statuses, independence, free association, statehood. Like if Guam were to move from being unincorporated territory to a different political status, and sometimes I think if Guam became independent or some sort of free association, the U.S. federal law might no longer apply. And you talked about how when there was sort of the groundswell of support, or the sort of grassroots support for women's, legal right to an abortion here, that's, I guess what I'm asking is, do you think that Guam really wants an abortion ban, like in itself, the people of Guam, or not?
No, I don't think so. I mean, my experience in that lawsuit, and in talking to people, and in even in just, the last couple of decades since that lawsuit, I mean, I think people generally support the right to an abortion, even in Guam, and but as with the right to an abortion, it's a very private thing. People are not necessarily willing to discuss it or talk about it, because most people view it as an issue of privacy. It's what happens in the bedroom, it's what happens with a woman's own body. They don't want to talk to other people about it necessarily, and by the same token, they don't want to be to have other people's views imposed upon them. It's a very private right. That's why it's called, a right of privacy. And so I think that, for example, if we had, a poll or a survey that was done today on Guam, do you support the right to an abortion in Guam? as opposed to, do you want all abortions to be banned on Guam? Do you support the right to an abortion on Guam? I think you'd be really interested in what the survey would say. When a survey was done and commissioned by the University of Guam back then during the abortion case, a plurality of people basically disagreed with Governor Atta's decision in signing the bill into law. I think there was like 44% disagreed with it, 39% agreed with it, but it basically showed that Guam was not overwhelmingly pro-life as many people, kind of assumed. I mean, in direct answer to your question, I don't really believe that a lot of people support an abortion ban on Guam. And primarily because of the right to privacy, but also because, in Guam, we're unlike other states. You can't just drive to another state to get an abortion the way that you can in the United States. You can't go to another county, you can't go to another city, you can't drive across to another state. You've got to go to Japan or the Philippines or Hawaii. And those are long distances to travel. That's a lot of money, it's a lot of inconvenience, it's a lot of, it has an impact on a woman's health, So, I really believe that people, would not support an abortion ban in Guam.
Oddly?
I'm not really familiar with, women's access to health care now. I mean, I was aware of it, when I was doing the lawsuit, because that formed a big part of, the case, and, how women had access to health care, and whether or not that law would infringe on that access to health care. Now, as far as I know, I think I think there is a big impact on women who don't have the sort of socioeconomic status or even the educational status to be aware about what's available in Guam in terms of contraceptives or, even just generally, women's reproductive health care. But other than that, I can't really speak specifically to that issue.
For example, I've heard that in the public school system here, there is an abstinence-based sex ed curriculum. And I've polled my students at the university, and they've told me similar things as well. I've spoken to public health workers about it. So that's, a little troubling. And the high rates of teen pregnancy on Guam, for example. Yeah, it's just something that I see these things tying together,
Well, of course they are. I mean, they're all tied together. When you talk about a woman's access to health care, that has an impact on whether or not they're going to get, adequate prenatal care, whether they're even going to get education or, medical care involving, just their body, and whether or not they're even prepared to, bear a child. So, all of those things are definitely intertwined. In terms of, what the policy is in public high schools or private high schools about contraception or abstinence or reproductive health, those are policy decisions that are being made by the legislators, that are being made by the governor and the administration. Whether or not those actually work, I'm not so sure. And just as you mentioned, the teenage pregnancy rate apparently is indicating that it's not working. We have a very high teenage pregnancy rate. I believe that it's gone down in the last couple of years, but it's always been extremely high, and it's been one of the highest in the nation. And as far as I know, I haven't really seen any comprehensive report or study that can definitively say why we have that high rate, whether it's that they don't have access to health care or contraceptives. I don't know.
Yeah.
Actually, having seen the abortion debates in the United States and been involved in the protests and demonstrations back there, I actually thought that the protests and the demonstrations and the discussion in Guam were a lot tamer. We did not have the type of really, emotional divisiveness and, rhetoric and violence in Guam that occurs in the United States when this issue is raised. Back then, when we had the law, certainly there was demonstration, there were protests, there was haranguing from the pulpit in all of the different, Catholic churches by the priests. But, you know, I really found that there was more of a respectful debate about it and a respectful discussion about it, way more than occurs in the United States. If you look at the debate and discussion that's going on now about abortion rights here on Guam, there are a few people who are not from Guam who have really imported the sort of mainland style of rhetoric into the abortion debate here in Guam, and who are just, you know, downright, you know, no, I mean, I guess that I'm trying to think about the right term, but it's basically, you know, they just aren't taking any hostages. It's a no hostage, you know, type of a situation where they're going to, any person who is in favor of abortion rights, they're going to castigate them, demean them, you know, bring in their family, you know, et cetera. And I don't know if you guys, if any of you have looked at any of those blogs, but they're really mean-spirited, they're divisive, they're violent. You know, one person accused one of the female senators of having an abortion when she never had, you know, and of calling people, trying to call people out, calling the senators out if they supported, you know, the right to an abortion in any way, shape, or form. That is not something that we saw back in the 1990s. That's really U.S. mainland imported rhetoric that I really disagree with, and that I think has no place here on Guam. You know, we never had it before. We shouldn't be having it now. And I think it's, I guess the best way to say it is, you know, I think it's really shameful that people do that, because we're a small island. You know, and I think people understood that back in the 1990s. People understood that at some point along the way, you know, we know each other's families. We have to live with each other. During a typhoon, during an emergency, we're going to call on each other. And we're not going to do this in your face, you know, political, you know, speech or demonstration that happens so much in the United States. Because in the United States, you can put down your, you know, your protest signs and you can go back to your home and you're probably never going to see these other people again. In Guam, you will. And, you know, I've learned, just like in the legal field, you know, you don't burn your bridges. You know, people understand that even though we may be very upset and very divided about an issue, we know that at some point down the line, somewhere in our careers, somewhere in our children's lives, we're going to call on our neighbors because we're going to need them and they're going to need us. And so the rhetoric back in the 1990s was really a lot tamer. Nowadays, with the people who are doing the blogs and who are, you know, on the anti-abortion movement, they are just, you know, incredibly, incredibly divisive. And I don't like it. I don't agree with it.
Oh, yeah. And how does one deal with that kind of imported divisive rhetoric? Have you been the target
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, I was put up on the blog. You know, my mother's name was put up on the blog as well. You know, some of my other family members. Well, you know, you give more power to people like that when you respond to them. And so I tend to ignore people like that because paying attention to them feeds on their ego. And so much of this is about ego and about how they feel like their position is right and they want to prove that they're right and, you know, that kind of thing. And so I ignore it unless there's, you know, a bill before the legislature that I feel very strongly about that I will go and testify against. I think one of the attractions for, you know, much of the media and the national press about this case was the fact that my mother had sponsored, you know, the anti-abortion bill, and then, you know, here was her daughter who was opposing it, not only in the legislature, but also, you know, in court. And so the attraction for the media was, you know, wow, this is a, you know, they played on it in every possible way that they could. They called it the generational gap. They called it, you know, this is the sign of the times. And in many ways it was all of that, you know, but it was also about two very strong persons who had very different, you know, opposing views about an issue and yet could still, live together and be a family, despite those opposing views. As I said before, our family was raised to be, very independent thinkers, very opinionated people. We were not only allowed, we were encouraged to express our opinions, and that's what happened in this case. My mother had her opinion about this issue. She felt strongly about it and sponsored this bill, and I had my opinion about it and felt very, very strongly about it and opposed it, and then filed an action in court, based on my views. I think one thing that's really not mentioned very often about the case is that another irony is that the person who wrote Guam's abortion law was Senator Conception. Conception Barrett. Her name is Senator Conception Barrett, and her daughter, Elizabeth Barrett Anderson, was the Attorney General at the time who issued a decision or an Attorney General opinion opining that Public Law 20-134 was unconstitutional. Guam's abortion law, really just tracks the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade, and that abortion law, which still remains the law today, was passed back in 1973 when Senator Barrett was one of the few female senators in the Guam legislature. So, it's not just a story about my mother and I, it's also a story about, here's a strong female Guam senator, Senator Barrett, sponsoring a law that, tracked the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade and allowed abortions in Guam. And then, her daughter, generations later, one generation later, issuing an Attorney General opinion opining that Public Law 2134 was unconstitutional and in violation of, her mother's law. So, those are, I think they're pretty consistent stories that we have, strong Chamorro women who have strong opinions about these kinds of issues, particularly when they affect our rights as women, to determine our own bodily integrity and autonomy. And it's not just, my mother and I and Senator Barrett and Liz Barrett Anderson, those are not anomalies. If you had been here during that time, you would have seen that, the strong women came out from all over Guam to protest this law, and they came out from all walks of life. And, they came out very strongly, against the law, and it was really to their credit that they came out, because there was a lot of pressure for people not to come out, against the law. There was, definitely the church. There was also familial pressure. Don't go out there and say anything about it. We don't want any repercussions, but people did. Well, it all begins at home, right? That's really where everything begins. And if you have discussions in home about, what your body is going through, the changes it's going through, and what you need to expect, and, what's going to happen, and how babies are made, and how they, are delivered. That's really where education begins, and it has to begin at the home. And, I think when you're not having that kind of education at home, so many misconceptions can happen with young girls and young boys, and that's, and then if you don't have it at home, then where are they going to get it? They're going to get it from their peers, and if their peers are, looking at the internet or getting information from, other sources that are not so credible or not so reliable, and they're passing that information on to, their classmates and their peers within their age group, they're not getting the best kind of information that we can possibly give them as parents. And it's a difficult thing, to talk to a girl about, or a boy, about sex and about, what their options are in terms of reproductive health care. But, those discussions have to be held, and it's not just about having babies. It's about transmission of sexual diseases and other healthcare issues that affect kids, not just reproductive rights and how babies are made. So to me, it really begins at home, and if we are teaching parents that they cannot discuss these kinds of issues with kids. It's taboo or it's forbidden, or you can only teach them one point of view, then, you know, in my opinion, I think we're giving a big disservice to our kids and not exposing them to all points of view about what options are out there and what's available to them. You know, so there's the school, and then, you know, in terms of the church and what they're teaching, you know, let's face it, a lot of people are Catholics. I am. You know, I go to church regularly. What they say at church, you know, resonates with a lot of people. It's where you get your religious instruction, and so a lot of kids and parents are going to be influenced by, you know, what is said in church. But, you know, I see in church also that there are many times when the priest will get up there and will give a homily about, you know, abortion, and we're having a right to life march here, and, you know, abortion is murder, etc. And I can see a lot of parents are really uncomfortable that this is being said in front of children, because, you know, are children really, you know, old enough to understand what this means? And if you're not having that discussion at home, and the only discussion you're having is a one-sided point of view from a priest in church or in, you know, a private Catholic school, then what are the kids really learning? You know, so in my opinion, I really believe it's very important for everyone to be educated and to be given all points of view about reproductive health care and about access to not just abortions, certainly abortions, but also, you know, contraceptives and everything else. If the first time that a child learns about contraceptives, you know, in adulthood, well, it's no wonder that we have, you know, such a high teenage pregnancy rate, right? It all begins with education. You know, that's one of the things that we presented in the abortion case. We thought that a really important part of the abortion case was to present evidence showing that, you know, abortions predated Catholicism here in Guam, that Chamorro women and Surahanas practice various methods of abortion, either with, you know, with certain herbs and medicines that they used, or, you know, with other, you know, types of, you know, manners, primarily herbal remedies and medicines that, you know, that would result in an abortion. You know, and we did that primarily because Governor Atta's attorneys asserted an argument in the case that essentially said that Guam is Catholic, abortions are not, you know, allowed here on Guam, and that law simply, you know, follows through with the Catholic tradition in Guam. And the subcontext of that is the Catholic, i.e. Chamorro tradition in Guam. And, you know, we just thought that was just not true because every article, every writing that we had ever seen and read about showed that, you know, abortions in Chamorro culture predated Catholicism. And just in answer to your question about, you know, Vince Diaz and his article, you know, I respect Vince, I respect his writings, I respect his opinions. I don't believe that, and I don't agree with his, you know, statements or his opinion that to be Chamorro is to be Catholic. You know, we have many Chamorros who are not Catholics. And that's really kind of taking away from them that, you know, they're not Chamorro, they have to be Catholic in order to be Chamorro. And I think that a lot of Chamorros would have a really big disagreement with that notion. Certainly, you know, Catholicism is a big part of our culture and our island now, but that wasn't always so, you know, and, you know, I don't think that I would say, you know, I'm Catholic because I'm Chamorro, or I'm Chamorro because I'm Catholic. You know, I am Chamorro because of my race. You know, Catholicism is something that is part of my religion. So, you know, you know, again, I think history and everything that we know about our Chamorro culture shows that, you know, abortions were practiced way back in times before Catholicism came to Guam.
Oh no.
Yeah, I'm good. Sorry, I know we take up a lot of your time.
Oh, Canditude. Okay. Thank you so much. Is there anything further that you would like to say? Or? we haven't asked you about? That you'd like to be on record or anything?
Not really. You know, I guess it's just interesting to me that, you know, this abortion issue continues to be, you know, so divisive and continues to be an issue. You know, I'm kind of feeling like, you know, 20 years on from that lawsuit, actually like 27 years on from this lawsuit, and we're still fighting, you know, this cause. We're still fighting this issue, and you know, I just had hoped and thought that this issue would be laid to rest with Roe versus Wade, but you know, it's becoming more and more of an issue because of the sort of conservative nature of many of the politicians who are, you know, now in Congress and who are, you know, in charge of public policy in not just Guam, but you know, everywhere in the United States. But you know, I believe that we're going to continue to see efforts to try to erode the right to an abortion, and it's really at this point, you know, an issue that has to end up in the U.S. Supreme Court, whether or not those types of laws, you know, are going to be upheld or not. So, I mean, is the premise of that article that I shouldn't have gone outside of Guam and I should have just, you know, had my own opposition here, and
No, it wasn't about
or
that.
I was importing like an American westernized viewpoint? Is that the premise of it?
I can't fully recall, but it was critiquing like the ACLU's involvement and that woman with
Janet.
the directory, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was looking at like their whole like use of you kind of thing. I can't remember, and I'm totally paraphrasing. So
Oh, that's interesting.
I need to find it and send it to you, and then you'll just have your opinion of it. You know, because it really was interesting when I read it.
So, you know, in the public interest area of law, which is what I practiced back in San Francisco and also as a law student, there is this notion that when you try to effect change, and particularly changes in public policy through the law, you don't do it just, you know, individually, and in many cases you don't do it just with the case in front of you. You do it globally,
Right.
because whatever public policy affects Guam will affect the United States, and everybody recognized that, which is why, you know, people became involved in it. The media, you know, put a lot of attention in Guam, is because that law was going to have a huge impact on the Supreme Court cases that were coming up involving and challenging the right to an abortion. And so in the public interest area of law, we always look at how do we get the best and the most widespread amount of support for our particular issue, and you know what we want to do, like the right to an abortion. And that's why, you know, I reached out to the ACLU in San Francisco when I did all these cases. The ACLU, many civil rights organizations were involved in my lawsuits, because that's how you get the broadest impact. You know, it wasn't because, you know, I couldn't do it on my own. Or absolutely.
Yeah, it's the only way to go.
Let's face it, it worked.
Yeah.
I mean, it got the intent.
Yeah.
It got the attention of a lot of Congress people, like Barbara Boxer and you know, George Miller, who oversaw a lot of Guam issues, you know, in their committees in Congress, and they were just appalled about the law. And so it definitely worked, because there was a lot of attention paid. Not the type of attention that the governor wanted, you know, because it was a lot of negative attention, but it worked in terms of making sure that, you know, this kind of an issue this kind of a law should not go into effect in Guam.